pleased now to be able to introduce our speaker, Professor Tim Ayers. We're extremely grateful to Tim for doing this. We had hoped to have this meeting in London, of course, and that hope persisted until a couple of weeks ago. But it became increasingly clear that this is going to be impractical and, if not, illegal. And so here we are on Zoom. Tim's responded sort of heroically, really, given his teaching and work schedule at York, and has agreed to do this for us in this format. And so, you know, I'm sure we're all very grateful for this. I certainly am, and I know the other members of the BAA Council are as well. To introduce Tim, for those of you who don't know as much about him as you would like to, Tim is Professor of History of Art at York, and he's now also the President of the International Corpus of Vitriarum Medievae. That's a recent appointment. He's, for some sin committed in a past life, co-director of the Centre for Medieval Studies at York as well, so he's really got his plate full. Tim's had a long-standing involvement with the BAA, a very happy one, and you know, apart from other things, he edited the Rochester transactions when we had the conference in Rochester back about 20 years ago. Maybe not that long, but I can't quite remember. It was before my time. He's known to most medievalists as an authority on 13th and 14th century stained glass. A scholarship in that quarter includes magisterial volumes published under the aegis of the Corpus Vitriarum on Wells Cathedral and also Merton College, Oxford. When doing the Merton glass and the Merton volumes, this involved a lot of editing on, and work at least, if not editing, on the accounts of, and a certain amount of editing, of course, on the accounts of Merton College. And I don't know if this is what encouraged him to take on this sort of extraordinary task of editing the 13th and 14th century fabric accounts of St. Stephen's Chapel, Westminster, but he evidently has a flair for it, and so this is what he has now done. Over the past number of years, he's been working on and heading up a large grant-funded project on the fabric of St. Stephen's Chapel, which aims to reconstruct digitally and also textually, and in terms of whatever we've got, really, bring together all this information that we have about St. Stephen's. These accounts have now been published in a sort of Brobdingnagian volume by Boydell. It's just out. You want to get your hands on it if you can. I think it's 1,543 pages long or something like that. Tim has edited these Latin accounts, and they've been translated by Maureen Jurovsky. And you know, it's a monument of scholarship on English Gothic art, and extremely important. And that's what Tim is going to speak to us about tonight. So it's goodbye from me, and hello from Tim. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Julian. It's great to be back at the BAA. I'm very sorry not to be with you all in person at the Antiquaries, but I'm really delighted to be with you here live, at least this evening. So attention, I'm going now to try to show you my PowerPoint. I hope that is now visible.
Yep, that's now visible. You're good.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So, as Julian start off, here we are at the very beginning. As Julian explained, I'm going to be talking about St. Stephen's Chapel in the Palace of Westminster. So a very splendid royal chapel at the heart of English medieval political life. And last spring, an 8-year project came to fruition with the delivery of our critical edition of the fabric accounts of this famous building. And here's the front cover up on the screen. So right in the middle of lockdown, it was all inevitably a bit of an anticlimax. We couldn't celebrate with the people involved, and we couldn't really launch it. So it's wonderful to have an opportunity to present it to you now. First, I should just say a word about the people. This has been a collaborative project. The accounts are almost all held at the National Archives in Kew, and we're very grateful to them for allowing us to publish them. But above all, I want to pay tribute to Dr. Maureen Jakowski, who has transcribed and translated the accounts. So Maureen brought vast experience with working on the records of medieval governments, and it's been a huge privilege to work with her. We were introduced by the late Professor Mark Ormrod, and he recognised that a project on this scale couldn't be done without a partnership of this kind. And I should just say that Mark's recent untimely death is a very sad loss to medieval studies. So the project. Once upon a time, long before the pandemic, historians and art historians at the University of York planned an interdisciplinary study of St. Stephen's Chapel across disciplines and across a long time span from the 13th to the 20th century. And we wanted this to be a biography of the building, to look at the medieval chapel and the House of Commons that succeeded it. As many of you will know, St. Stephen's became the House of Commons from the 1540s. And across that long durée, we wanted to look at the relationship between liturgical space and political space. And this turned into the AHRC research projects that you can explore on our website, and the address is up here on the screen. But before we kind of embarked on all this, Mark Ormrod and I agreed that a new critical edition of the 14th century fabric accounts was needed to pave the way for wider research. And in doing that, we were actually picking up on a suggestion that had been made by Howard Colvin 50 years or so ago. The relevant accounts are to be found among the unusually well-preserved records of English medieval royal government. They are extremely extensive. There are over 60 of them, and I'm showing you a rather frightening list here. Our edition includes records for the chapel and also for the College of St. Stephen between 1292, when Edward I began to rebuild an earlier chapel, and the 1390s, when Richard II was completing facilities for St. Stephen's College. So the accounts provide an extended opportunity to study this very important building in its different construction periods. And there are over 600 pages of transcription. This evening, I want to do two things. First, to put the publication of the accounts into a longer perspective, looking back to the beginning of the study of medieval art and architecture in this country. And second, to take a case study that shows how the accounts can be used to explore the building. And for that, I'm going to be looking at some of the things that the accounts reveal about the chapel in the years before and after the arrival of the Black Death in London, just 672 years ago, in the autumn of 1348. As this audience will know very well, St. Stephen's Chapel has been the object of intense interest to art and architectural historians for over a century, from W.R. Letheby, John Harvey, Maurice Hastings and Howard Colvin, to Christopher Wilson, Paul Binsky, John Goodall, James Hilson, and many others. They've explored the importance of the chapel to the King's works and to the development of English medieval art and architecture. The accounts have also been flagged up as highly significant for an understanding of the crafts more generally, such as wall painting by E.W. Tristram and stained glass by L.F. Saltzman and Richard Marks. Scholars have been able to consult the original documents in the National Archives, but for those less familiar with the material, that can be a major challenge. The sheer number of the rolls makes them tricky to navigate. And as you can see from the structure of this list, they're distributed across different kinds of government records. And they're in the abbreviated Latin of government clerks. So we hope that a new critical edition setting out the relationships between the roles and providing a translation and supporting apparatus will make them available to a new generation of scholars. I rapidly discovered that building accounts are understudied as a kind of source, both in the UK and on the continent, but they survive in quantity, especially from the later Middle Ages. Gunter Binding's book on the building trade in the Middle Ages, first published in German in 1993, provides a useful broad list. In English, the most interesting recent work on accounts as accounts has been by scholars of language on the development of that abbreviated and hybrid Latin vernacular in account rolls within a multilingual society. And I'm thinking particularly of the work of Laura Knight and her projects on the London Bridge accounts. Needless to say, fabric accounts vary a great deal in form. As Howard Colvin pointed out long ago and demonstrated in his medieval volumes for the history of the King's works, the well-preserved records of the formidable Plantagenet Exchequer provide an exceptional insight into English royal building. And Colvin's own edition of fabric accounts, royal fabric accounts for the reign of Henry III, which appeared back in 1971, has been a useful model actually for us with its parallel translations. Other new work is happily underway on the accounts for York Minster, for example, and Charlotte Stanford published the accounts for the early Tudor Savoy Hospital recently. It was very good to hear Christopher Patterson's paper based on his doctoral project too, a little while ago, to this society. But accounts could certainly do with the sort of inclusive study that Susie Nash has been pioneering for inventories. So we needed a new edition, but one of the big surprises of the project was the early, if partial, publication of the accounts for St. Stephen's in the late 18th and early 19th century. And I want now to explore how this came about and its broader significance for the study of medieval art and architecture. Medieval administrative documents had sometimes been used by antiquaries and historians of art before. Richard Gough referred to wills, indentures and contracts in his great two-volume study of sepulchral monuments, published in 1786 and 1796. And of wider circulation was Horace Walpole's Anecdotes of Painting in England. As a fine art, painting was of great interest to cultivated contemporaries, and his book was actually published in 4 editions by 1800. I'm showing you here the title page and frontispiece to the first edition of volume 1. And as you can see, his history looked back to the Middle Ages, not surprising, of course, in the builder of Strawberry Hill. On the left here, the frontispiece shows 2 stained glass panels in which the figures of Christ and the Virgin Mary are significantly misidentified as Henry III and his wife. Making use of George Virtue's researches in the government archives, Walpole tracked the history of painting back to the 13th century, particularly through English royal patronage, including Henry III's work at Westminster. Walpole was particularly concerned with the origins of oil painting, and he noticed that the entries that Virtue had excavated from the accounts included purchases of oil. And this began a long-running debate about the meaning of these references, to which our accounts would also make a significant contribution. Between 1795 and 1836, St. Stephen's itself was the object of intensive study in no less than 3 publications. And in these, the accounts became increasingly prominent. The occasion was the coming together of two powerful streams of thought and activity. The first was a growing interest in the medieval past. The place of St. Stephen's in the development of the Gothic revival and antiquarianism has been studied recently by Rosemary Hill. We were delighted that she was involved in our HRC project. And as she has shown, the building was repeatedly a focus of attention because the structure was too small for the demands of the House of Commons that it contained. The resulting interventions and building works brought to light the splendour of the former chapel, prompting new ways of thinking about medieval buildings and their preservation. The second activity was a long and intensifying desire to publish government records, including many from the Middle Ages. From the 17 volumes of Reimer's Foedera, published between 1704 and 1735, to Domesday Book, published in 1783. And on the screen here, I'm showing you the multi-volume set of the Parliament Rolls, published between 1767 and 1777. So how did these initiatives come together? The first publication of our three appeared in 1795, prompted by a report into the inadequacy of buildings in the ancient Palace of Westminster. On the back of its alarming recommendations, the Society of Antiquaries sent John Carter to record the fabric of the chapel. This resulted in the impressive Atlas Folio format volume, the very first in the Antiquaries Cathedral series. And here I'm showing you Carter in a suitably medieval interior, drawn by himself, so his very own zoom background. And also on the right here, one of his magnificent coloured drawings of the chapel today in the Society of Antiquaries, which we used for our cover. The short introduction to this volume was written by John Topham and identified for the first time that there were extensive fabric rolls for the building. And he explains that these records had been drawn to his attention by Craven Ord in the King's Remembrances Office, where they were kept. We came across Ord again during preparation of the edition, rather surprisingly, as one of our rolls had escaped into his private ownership. Both Topham and Ord were fellows of the Antiquaries, so part of an elite group with an interest and knowledge of such things. By 1790, Topham was librarian to the Archbishop of Canterbury and had been one of the contributors to the production of the Parliament Rolls. The second publication was prompted by the destruction of parts of the eastern bay of St. Stephen's Chapel to accommodate new Irish MPs in 1800 and 1801. J.T. Smith was allowed to draw the remains before they were removed. And I'm showing you here a view of the eastern wall that was uncovered at that time up on the left. Smith's records were then published in his Antiquities of Westminster in 1807, up on the right title page, produced in a collaboration with the scholarly John Hawkins. Now this was the first volume to publish an extensive selection from the fabric accounts, offering material from 25 rolls, filling no less than 40 pages. And as far as I know, the extent of this publication of accounts was unprecedented for an English medieval building, and perhaps any English building. The title page advertised this use of original documents, which, and I quote, throw new and unexpected light on the ancient history of the arts in England. And these sources were indeed put to new and unexpected uses. Hawkins focused in on the work of the painters, for example. He knew Walpole's book, he refers to it, and like Walpole, he drew attention to purchases of oil mentioned in the St. Stephen's accounts. To find out what these meant, Hawkins turned to a London apothecary called John Haslam, for a chemical analysis of the surviving paintings. Haslam then identified the pigments and confirmed that they were indeed in an oil medium in the very first known published analysis of paint samples. A remarkable bringing together of the paintings themselves, documentary evidence, and scientific analysis to address an art historical question. In the 20th and the 21st centuries, the architecture of the chapel has often preoccupied scholars, and understandably so. But at the beginning of the study of St. Stephen's, painting was quite as important as a motor for scholarly interest. So how did Hawkins come by these records? The preface to his The Antiquities of Westminster explains that he had turned again to the King's Remembrancer's Office. There, the search had been helped by another official, George Van der Zee. Van der Zee found the relevant rolls and lent his own clerk to make extracts, and he was undoubtedly the right person to consult. As the preface to Smith's volume explains, Van der Zee had overseen, and I quote, the removal of the records on pulling down in 1793 some old rooms near those where the Court of Exchequer sit. And I'm showing you on the left here, William Capon's watercolour of this site. And his plan of the same spot is inscribed, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, in the middle towards the bottom, rather satisfyingly, room for records taken down 1793. So this building in the middle in the picture on the left was presumably the home to our particular group of Exchequer records by that date, very close to the medieval Exchequer building itself, of which of course they're a product. And Van der Zee also oversaw the relocation of these records after 1793. Smith's publication coincided with a much wider impetus towards improved care and dissemination of government records. Their perceived inaccessibility had led to the appointment of a parliamentary select committee in 1800. This then made recommendations about repositories, archival preservation, finding aids, and publication. And as a result, a record commission was established in the same year. This would be the first of 6, and some familiar names were involved. At the beginning, our old friend John Topham served as their secretary. Van der Zee submitted a report to the select committee, published a volume himself, and continued to report on his Exchequer records until 1837. A year later, in 1838, the recommendations of the Commission for the Centralisation of Record Storage led to the establishment of the Public Record Office, a giant leap forward in the professionalisation of record keeping. Staff would be salaried, so the amateurism and the roaming records would end. This wish to increase public access was important for the publication of records for St. Stephen's because, as we've seen, it was the officials in charge who passed them on to our authors. It was another secretary to the Record Commission, C.P. Cooper, who made available the records for our third and final publication, The History of the Ancient Palace and Late Houses of Parliament. This was published in 1836, so just 2 years after the fire that totally destroyed the House of Commons and much of the ancient palace. And on the right is one of the many views made at that time and afterwards of the spectacle from the Thames. The plates in the book showed the resulting devastation, and curious visitors sometimes on site, capturing its new role as a public visitor attraction. On the left here is a view of the interior of the former House of Commons and the chapel looking east. The authors were E.W. Brayley and John Britton, a well-established partnership in the publication of volumes of antiquarian interest. The book was smaller than either, a lot smaller than either of the 2 previous books at octavo size, and the price was pitched competitively, as they explained, calculating on an extensive sale. With Cooper's help, this book contains 70 pages of accounts, including many new ones, those for Edward II's reign for the first time, for example. This huge contribution signals again the perceived importance of the site and the roles to an understanding of it. They're organised more coherently than Smith's and Hawkins, but one does wonder what a wider public made of so many documents without a detailed commentary. And I'm showing you here what these 70 pages are like. This handy volume may have been offered for public interest, but it was also a resource for a new generation of scholars, professionals, and specialists who were starting to think more critically about archival sources and about art and architecture in the 1840s. In his government-sponsored study of St. Stephen's Chapel, published in 1844, on the left here, the trained surveyor Frederick Mackenzie drew attention to the challenges of using accounts, the lost records, the things that aren't described, the unfamiliar terminology. The pioneering architectural historian Robert Willis, based at Cambridge, made ample use of the accounts, among other sources, in his glossary of medieval architectural terms, so addressing Mackenzie's problem, which was published in the same year, 1844. In George Gilbert Scott's famous study of Westminster Abbey, first published in 1861, Willis then presented a recently discovered fabric roll of 1253 for the Abbey's construction with a commentary. And I'm showing you here the opening page on the right. So here documents were put in more rigorous service to the kind of inductive architectural history that Willis was advocating. But the accounts were not only useful for the developing discipline of architectural history, those assessing other crafts addressed them too. Working at the National Gallery, Charles Eastlake picked up again on Walpole's theme in his book, Materials for a History of Oil Painting, published in 1847 and referred to the accounts. And Charles Winston's pioneering essays on the history of stained glass, appearing in that same year, 1847, used the detailed descriptions of the glaziers employed at St. Stephen's as a basis for a discussion of a medieval workshop. So I hope I've shown that the preservation of records and the recording of medieval buildings for their preservation went hand in hand for St. Stephen's Chapel. This set a precedent for the highest profile for the integration of this kind of documentary record into the study of art and architecture. In my second section, I want to turn to what the accounts may contribute to an understanding of the building and its decoration. And I showed you earlier that the exceptional extent of these documents. So I picked a case study, as I said, the relationship between the making of St. Stephen's and the Black Death, an oddly unexplored moment, and one for which the records have exceptional potential. Both the building and its decoration and the records themselves span the first arrival of the plague. This had reached the south coast in the summer or early autumn of 1348 and London by November. It was at its height in the capital in January and February 1349. The outbreak persisted into the summer and meanwhile spread out across the country. There's general agreement that the pandemic of 1348-9 killed between a third and a half of the population. So what do the accounts for St. Stephen's reveal about what happened to the chapel project, both during the initial outbreak and afterwards? And what's their wider significance for understanding the chapel and the king's works within royal government? Studies of the chapel have rarely made much, published studies have rarely made much of this topic. Howard Colvin's brilliant analysis of the building history in the history of the king's works, for example, made no mention of the Black Death at all. Others have seen the completion of the chapel as the fulfillment of earlier ambitions and ideas. The project did feature in Philip Linley's very useful survey of the effects of the plague upon recorded masons, monument makers, manuscript production, and wall painting, and their styles of working. He presented evidence for the diminished number of projects undertaken afterwards, labour shortages, rising wage rates, and changing modes of employment. By contrast, the completion of St. Stephen's is held up by him as an example of, and I quote, example of the richness and brilliance of the best work. But he points to Richard Marx's suggestion that the impressment of glaziers in the 1350s could be related to shortages of labour in London in the wake of the plague. Let's look first at the accounts that record building work on either side of the arrival of the Black Death in autumn 1348. So this is a table showing what survives between 1347 and 1354. As you can see, on the left here, we have an account for 1347 to 8 compiled by the Deputy Clerk of Works, Peter of Bridgenorth. The incumbent clerk was away, and I'll come back to that. The roll ends on the 10th of August, just 4 days after the foundation of Edward III's great new College of St. Stephen at Westminster and its sister institution, St. George's at Windsor. In the account, there are signs that parts of the work were ending that summer. A timber vault was being installed from October 1347, but had probably been completed by July when the carpenters moved on. In other ways, though, we shouldn't see the end of the account as the end of the work. It was Exchequer practice for account rolls to close at the end of a Clerk of Works term of office, and the close of this one marks the retirement of Peter of Bridgenorth. The patent rolls duly record the appointment of a replacement as deputy, a man called Thomas of Stapleford. Bridgenorth's retirement could have been at some significant moment in the work, we don't know, but the entries for the final week suggest that there were still plenty of people working on the site, so it looks as though work of some kind was going to carry on into the autumn, poor things. As later accounts show, building around the chapel and on its furnishing would continue for over a decade. As you can see from the table though, in the column on the left, no record survives for Stapleford's term of office. He certainly survived the plague in 1348 to 49. In fact, he became the full Clerk of Works at Westminster in 1355. So the gap in the accounts may have been to do with a disruption of administrative procedures, or it may simply that his account has been lost since. We also lack detailed accounts thereafter. But we do have a summary account beginning in January 1349 in the column on the right at the top. And I'm also showing you rather gratuitously a mighty, this was entered on the pipe roll, this summary, and I'm showing you rather gratuitously a mighty pipe roll up on the screen. Pipe rolls were the official record of the audit of accounts at the Exchequer. Now, our summary covers 3 years of the clerkship of a man called Walter of Weston. Walter was responsible at Westminster from January. The summary was compiled by his executors after his death, but we know that it draws upon annual particulars of accounts that once existed because it refers to them, which were, and I quote, delivered here into the Treasury. The well-established process for approving the clerk's account by a controller involving the making of a copy is also mentioned. So the whole cumbersome system of accounting at the Exchequer was in operation by Michaelmas 1349. So on this occasion, the accounts were made and submitted, but certainly lost since. The sources for St. Stephen's say nothing about the plague itself. Not surprisingly, this was not their purpose. But other sources set these bald records in context. At the top of St. Stephen's College, the plague killed Thomas Cross, the first dean, and on the building site, William Ramsay, the master mason. Elsewhere at Westminster, senior government officers succumbed, including the Chancellor, John Offord, and exchequer officials. The treasurer left Westminster for his episcopal estates in January at the height of the outbreak. In the same month, it was recorded that the barons of the exchequer did not do business for fear of their lives. A parliament scheduled for January was postponed and the law courts closed after Trinity term. Yet for all that, as Mark Ormerod has shown, English royal government was remarkably resilient. The exchequer and chancery remained open. If business was curtailed initially, there was a rapid recovery in its volume, and within a year, he concluded that the exchequer was functioning largely as normal. The king had spent the first 6 months of 1349 largely out of town, but he returned to Westminster in the summer. So turning back to the accounts, the rendering of account at Michaelmas is not very surprising. But the summoning of Walter of Weston in January 1349 looks highly significant. Walter proved to be one of the most colourful clerks of works of those who were responsible for St. Stephen's in our project. Unusually, he'd been appointed for life back in 1331 by the young King Edward III, so as a mark of special favour. And after that, he had gone off to run the writing office in Gascony, and it's likely that he was related to other Westons close to the king, such as Philip Weston, the king's confessor. For long periods during the 1330s and 40s, Walter was away on other major duties as keeper of the Channel Islands and later deputy constable of Bordeaux. So by 1349, this was a trusted royal servant and a man of long administrative experience. The decision to bring him back from Gascony to Westminster when the plague was most desperate suggests Edward III's determination to push on with the project. After a year in the job, in January 1350, Weston was further rewarded with a prebend in St. Stephen's College. So what did Weston do over this, no doubt, difficult year? We don't know when he arrived exactly, but entries in the summary account suggest that new work was both planned and prepared. It includes only general references to craftsmen, but a lot of references to materials. And I want to focus especially on those for painting and glazing. So I'm showing you a graph here of the expenditure on these across the decade from 1348 to 1361. Before Michaelmas 1349, the summary records the purchase of materials costing nearly £12 in the left-hand column. So if you combine the blue bits and the orange bits. This doesn't, of course, necessarily mean that they were used, but towards the end of this financial year, the patent rolls also record an instruction to seek out glaziers for the chapel. Some other building work was going on for the king at this time in and around London. Scholars have drawn attention to the continuation of work on the Cradle Tower at the Tower of London in an account from September 1348, trailing off through the plague during the winter and then gathering momentum again. The Cradle Tower was of particular importance to the king as it provided a gate for royal access to his fortress. Resuming slightly later, possibly, perhaps, St. Stephen's seems to have been a priority too. And at this point, it may have been slightly ahead of its sister foundation, St. George's, Windsor, where works on the chapel began only in April 1350. At Westminster, work moved increasingly quickly in the 2 last years of Weston's clerkship. And on the table, I hope you can see that much larger sums are spent on materials for glass and paint in 1349 to 50 and 1350 to 51. And payments are now also being made explicitly in this summary account to glaziers and painters for their work. And again, this is confirmed by the patent rolls. In March 1350, Hugh Painter, John Athelard, Benedict Nightingale were tasked with seeking out painters in no less than 14 counties across 3 regions London and the South East, East Anglia and the Midlands. Later in the same month, the master glazier John of Lincoln was deployed to seek out glaziers in similar regions, this time across 27 counties. These are the entries that were mentioned by Richard Marks, and I'll come back to them in a moment. So by the time we reach June 1351, it's certain that both painters and glaziers were busily at work. Weston's successor of Clerk of Works was somebody called Robert of Campsall, and to him we owe the first detailed account roll from the period after the arrival of the Black Death. Starting in June 1351, it allows us to zoom in on the work in a whole new way. And I'm showing you a section of it on the screen here, setting out purchases of materials and payments to craftsmen week by week, beginning Monday, the 8th of August, 1351. As I mentioned before, this roll has long been recognised as a major document for the study of medieval crafts. I want to highlight simply the scale of the work, starting with the materials. An astonishing £230 was spent on painting and decorating in the year 1351-2 alone, as you can see here in this graph. This figure is partly explained by the quantities of gold leaf. These amounted to more than 70,000 foils, varying in price between 4 shillings and 5 shillings a dozen. This is very much consistent with the antiquarian descriptions of the interior as it was discovered in the late 18th and the 19th century. Remember, I showed you one of Carter's watercolours earlier. But the accounts, as well as gold leaf, also describe a rich variety of pigments, some of them very expensive, several different blues, ochre, red lake, red and white lead, verdigris and vermilion. So the accounts allow us to quantify in various ways an extraordinary investment in the material qualities and also ultimately the appearance of the King's Chapel. They also allow us to assess the quantity and quality of the labour that was employed on it. And here I'm going to take the glaziers as an example. We've seen that they've been recruited across southern and Midland England. The entries give detailed breakdowns of the workforce and what they were doing week by week, as I mentioned. But for my purpose this evening, I just want to draw your attention to the numbers. As you can see from the graph, over 30 were at work in June 1351, rising to over 40 in October and falling away to a close in March 1352. And you can see that they had a week off over Christmas. As I mentioned, Richard Marks suggested that this recruitment of craftsmen from outside London was a result of the shortage of skilled labour in the capital. And this certainly may well have been a consideration. But I think it must be more than that. We're hampered by the lack of documentation for English glazing to compare this account with. But at York Minster, the master glazier for the Great East Window was contracted in 1405 to do all of the designing himself. At Exeter Cathedral in the early 1300s, payments for finished work seem to have been made to a single unnamed master glazier. But at Westminster, we do not have just one master glazier. Up to 7 can be described in any one week, all paid by the day. And these master glaziers are shown out of the total numbers in yellow in the graph here. Typically, these masters are described as making drawings or designs, and in itself, this suggests, I think, the exceptional nature of the project. Something similar was also happening with the painters, where numbers of people are also tasked with design work. The sheer scale of the labour involved suggests that the king was determined to complete the job quickly and to the highest standard, gathering a large pool of talent from across his kingdom. So while the accounts may be revealing in all sorts of ways about craft generally, the processes that they describe may also be unusual and specific to some extent to this moment. They certainly represent a phenomenal exercise of royal power. To understand why, we must step away for a moment from the accounts to consider the key characteristics of Edward III's new foundation as a place to pray for the salvation of the king, his family, and his ancestors. This idea was already expressed in the foundation document for the college before the plague. The imagery of the chapel, dating from the 1350s, presents a very particular kind of kingship that has been analysed by, to name a few of the more recent, Paul Binsky, Emily Howe, James Hilson, Mark Ormerod, and Jane Spooner. Up on the screen here, I'm showing you our recent visualisation of the easternmost bay of the chapel. You can see, I hope, the painted tableau that was created on either side of the high altar. Today, this is known to us predominantly from Richard Smirke's wonderful painting and drawings in the Society of Antiquaries, and I'm showing you these down below. On the left, Edward III and his sons kneel beneath the adoration of the Magi, guided by the king's favourite saint, St. George. And on the right are the women of the royal family beneath the presentation in the temple. Around the walls, dramatic and dazzling heraldic decoration represented the English aristocratic order that had triumphed in war against the French at Crécy in 1346, with St. George and English royal saints at the head of this succession of heraldry. In that same decade, in the 1340s, the flower of English chivalry had gathered around an Arthurian round table at Windsor, and then in the Order of the Garter, which was established there in the King's New College of St. George in 1348. In August 1349, as the plague continued its journey north, the King's Chancellery wrote to English bishops, urging them to encourage the performance of penance for sin and the prayers of the faithful. Like so many other apparent acts of God before and since, the plague was commonly understood as an expression of divine wrath. And this is surely one of the reasons at least, why the chapel was pursued with such vigour from 1349, to create a setting for the performance of an elaborate liturgy on behalf of the Plantagenets as an act of piety in a time of trial, and perhaps later of thanksgiving. It's clear that many of the ideas expressed in the chapel's imagery were already in play before the Black Death. But there's been disagreement about whether the paintings themselves refer to more recent events of this kind. For example, in the possible representation of the king's daughter Joan, who died of the plague in 1348, or in the prominent sufferings of Job. And on the left here, I'm showing you the surviving painting of the death of Job's children, now in the British Museum. And on the right, an enigmatic little female figure over here, who's represented in a kind of anteroom to the main devotional sequence of royal women. But more generally, the making of this image and the furnishing of the chapel was surely a reassertion of order, no less clearly than appears in the accounts. After the severest challenges, the king is reasserting his central role in his kingdom and before God. So what do the detailed accounts reveal about how the craftsmen were employed at St. Stephen's? We've already seen that the patent rolls record the impressments of glaziers and painters from the summer of 1349. Here are the glaziers again. In the history of the king's works, Howard Colvin argued that the right to impress went back to the common duty to perform military service, and that Edward III turned a military obligation into a broader one, including for royal building works. This kind of recruitment had been used increasingly from the 1340s, including for the recently excavated round table at Windsor, as recent studies have shown. So impressment was not a direct result of the Black Death, but rather an established technique that was developed with a new intensity under new circumstances. And the same is true for the royal purveyance of materials. Purveyors start to appear in our accounts during the 1340s, but become an established feature in the years after 1348. In these devices, Edward III was able to make use of recruiting tools that were not available to other patrons so readily. And the accounts also give us rates of pay. Here are the rates for masons and labourers from 1347 to 1356. It's certain that the high mortality of the Black Death empowered those who survived to demand higher wages. This was addressed by the King in the Ordinance of Labourers, issued at Westminster as early as August 1349, and then again in the Statute of Labourers passed in the 1351 Parliament there. Our account for 1351 to 52 and the other surviving accounts for the 1350s allow us to see what was actually happening to wage rates on the neighbouring building site. Earlier accounts had usually followed an established pattern through the year: higher rates in the longer days of spring and summer from the 2nd of February, and lower in the autumn and winter from the 1st of November. But in our roll for 1351 to 2, strikingly, seasonal wage rates were suspended. I hope you can see that these columns for the summer and the winter are the same height for both masons and labourers. Standard rates were paid throughout the year, not only to masons and labourers, but also to painters and glaziers. These rates are also higher than those set out in the Statute of Labourers just in February, so the law was apparently no obstacle to the King's will. But they are close to the higher seasonal rates that the King had paid in 1347 to 48. So in the left-hand column that I'm showing in each of these graphs. And in this, they may be consistent with another stated aim of the Statute of Labourers to maintain wages at the same levels as in 1346 to 47. Mark Ormerod has argued that the King's policy on labour was precisely to re-establish the situation as it had been in the good old days before the plague. So for the craftsmen and labourers at St Stephen's, the terms of employment responded to the labour market. This was a policy of carrots as well as sticks. In editing the rolls for the later 1350s, it was apparent that this situation did not stay the same, quite the opposite. The King's agents tried repeatedly to control their costs. And if we have another look at the table, by 1353 to 54, seasonal rates had returned for masons and labourers. So you can see that these columns are now of different height. Although the dates of transition were different from those applying previously, and they were different for the masons and the labourers. For both masons and labourers, the period of lower wages was now longer than it had been, but the rates of pay had mostly increased. In the next surviving roll of particulars for 1355 to 56, the terms have changed again, and the rates have crept up further for the masons, as you can see in the table. But now the former rates of transition, the 1st of November and the 2nd of February, were reasserted for the wages of both craftsmen and labourers. The volatility of these arrangements demonstrates both the higher wages that craftsmen could command and the efforts of the administration to reassert control. If the King paid generously to main craftsmen at other sites in later years, as Howard Colvin and R. Allen Brown argued at Windsor, St Stephen's probably set an early precedent. So who were the human motors for this administrative flexibility and resourcefulness through the 1350s? The Clerk of Works at Windsor from 1356 was none other than William of Wykeham, the later Chancellor of England, and Wickham has been identified as an innovative administrator there in the use of task work especially. I've suggested that clerks of works had a degree of autonomy at Westminster too, but it's also worth considering the role of the King's Treasurer, William of Eddington. Eddington served in this office across our period from 1344 to 1356. And Mark Ormerod has shown how he successfully negotiated the reform of royal finances after 1348 with innovations in taxation, currency, and the financing of the King's household. Elizabeth Biggs has explored his key role in the foundation of St. Stephen's College, where he was remembered in their Obit book. And on the right here, I'm showing you the relevant page in their calendar. So it's not surprising to find that his intervention is mentioned at key moments in the accounts too, smoothing the way to the acquisition of materials in the 1340s, distributing rewards to leading craftsmen in the 1350s at key moments. The most remarkable intervention was in September 1353, when the Treasurer and the King's Council met to review the design for new stalls, on which carpenters had been working for several years. The document explains that they rejected the backing for these and sold it off to the nuns of Barking Abbey. The reasons are unclear, but Eddington certainly had a say in the making of the chapel as well as the establishment of the college. Under Eddington's direction, the government of the kingdom and the commemoration of Edward III's kingship come together. I've outlined the extraordinary commitment to St. Stephen's Chapel in the years after 1348 and assessed the effects of the Black Death upon the progress of work and the making of the accounts. That commitment was driven by ideals of kingship, and I've suggested that this was probably informed by the Cataclysm too. But many questions remain. The chapel took a long time to complete, and it looks as though something happened in the mid-1350s. There was a long delay in the completion of the stalls for the community after 1353. Those paintings we saw could not be activated, as it were, and brought into relation with the college's round of liturgical performance. This is just one of many examples documented in the accounts that the building of St. Stephen's was highly responsible to changes in circumstances across the 6 decades of its creation. Rigorously structured by date and extraordinarily detailed, they allow us to study not a single story for the Royal Chapel, but a fractured process opening up multiple micro-histories. As I've tried to suggest, this temporal specificity also invites us to rethink what they may reveal about medieval crafts and their terms of work. But we very much hope that the edition will inspire scholars, young and old, to explore the accounts in new ways, many of which we certainly cannot imagine. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Tim, for that wonderful lecture and that wonderful account of the fact that these diachronic processes are not something that goes along with time, but they undulate according to circumstances, undulate according to the season, and also catastrophes and priorities, patronal priorities. There's all sorts of things that determine them. And although we medievalists have a sense of this anyway, we sort of assume this if we think about it, we very rarely are capable of demonstrating it in the way that you have and are able to through this extraordinary work you've done on these roles. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions. There was a lot of silent gestural attitudinizing sort of applause, and I'm sure there's going to be some questions as well. So if people would like to type their questions into the message box if they can see it, then I'll read those questions out. Or if Tim can see them, he can just answer them. I'm not sure if you'll be able to see them. Lots of applause. While we wait, Tim, I'll ask you, I mean, you said, you showed us those graphs with the relative expenditure in the years around the plague years and there are immediately after for glass and for painting. And you explained that the painting bill was high, perhaps because some of this paint was not actually used in the chapel, but also chiefly because there's so much gold leaf in there. Was as much spent on glass as you might expect in such a large, such a, you know, a luminous building? I take the point that this is partly Clizet glass and glass with red and blue stain, a bit like Gloucester, I suppose. But still, I'm not sure that that seemed like an enormous sum for them to be spending, actually.
I think that's a very, very interesting question. As you say, the problem is finding something to compare it with. And I haven't done that yet. I mean, it's one of the things I'm hoping to do next, is to actually dig a bit deeper into the painting and the glazing accounts to see what more one can tease out of them. But I think that's all. That's really all I can say at the moment.
That's fine, Tim.
I haven't got any overall figures for expenditure anywhere else in England that I can think of that
Sure.
would allow us to do that.
Okay, so we've got some questions coming through. Are the first one I have here is, are the supplies of pigments identified and are any of them directly imported? That's the question.
Yes. Are the suppliers of the materials are identified in great detail. Most of the materials come through London, both paint and gold and glass. Some of the glass is white glass. It comes from Surrey, Sussex, from the Weald. But most of it comes from London. The materials themselves came from much further afield, and I think one of the most another area that I'm hoping to explore is actually this relationship between London and Westminster, for which the accounts are an incredibly rich source.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. And another question. From Sarah Brown. Do you think the choice of counties from which artists and craftsmen were selected is significant?
I think that's a very interesting question. I suppose they are the counties that are closest to London. They include places where we know there were very large, relatively large communities of glaziers like Norwich, where David King has actually identified some of the glaziers at St Stephen's in local records. It's quite striking that York isn't there, in a way, given York's reputation as a centre for the making of stained glass. But I think it's a very good question, and I'd certainly like to look into that some more.
Okay. Another question then from Louise Hampson. Is there any evidence in their accounts that the plague had an impact on the cost and availabilities of materials? So of materials rather than labour? Yeah.
The problem here, in terms of what I was showing you, is that for paint and glass, they aren't painting and glazing before the plague. For other materials, there certainly is. So the price of lime, lead, for example, the value of lead shoots up, and actually the accounts are very good evidence for that.
Right. Jenny Stratford asks, absolutely fascinating, she says, do we have the individual rates of pay with fluctuations for the different craftsmen?
Yes, we do.
Okay. And Stephen Brindle asks and notes that detailed accounts for the windows of St George's Chapel, Windsor, actually painted by the Westminster Glass Workshop exist. So its costs and materials were covering the Windsor job as well, maybe. That's a that's a comment, really, rather.
That's a very good point, Stephen. And actually, I do think that the Westminster, I mean, as you say, there are so many crossovers. This is just one of the many crossovers between the projects at Windsor and Westminster, and it would be well worth putting them to try to think about them together to see whether the sum of their parts is greater than, whether we can come to the conclusions that are greater than the sum of the parts. But you're right. No, that's right. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. And John Goodall asks, he says that the differentials in cost are fascinating. Have you done a breakdown of relative costs of the building more widely, and where does the bulk of expenditure lie, in materials or labour?
Yes, is the simple answer to that. And in the volume, there are some tables of the relative costs. Hang on a second, I'll just go and get it.
I hope you're feeling strong.
Yeah, you need a bit of a lect. So let's see.
Just the sort of book you don't want to have to try and use in an electronic copy, actually.
Absolutely not. No, quite. Okay, so I mean, the easiest place to get these is in the summary accounts, where they summarise the overall cost of different kinds of the totals for different kinds of costs. So 13 November, let's have a look at this. So November 1323 to Michaelmas 1324, the cost of materials was £182 odd. Cost of transport was £33, and the cost of wages was £330.
Okay.
It's wages.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean,
this is when the building is really underway. Yeah. And that's drawn out across the other periods where we have these summary totals that we can put in relation to each other. That's a very good question. Yes, I mean they are very useful for that.
Yeah, that's a ready and very clear answer. Thank you. Glenn Davies asked, impressment is interesting if the rates of pay were good. Do we have any examples of craftsmen resisting such impressment?
Yes, we do. At Westminster in 1353, the king complained that his craftsmen were running away.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's a famous thing. Yes. So they were resisting. They're like these unfortunate men who were impressed to go to sea in the 17th and 18th century. James Hilson, inspiring stuff. You placed a heavy emphasis on the individuals responsible for the roles, which I think is often absent in studies of building accounts. How closely do you think the royal administrators were involved in the process?
That's a great question, James. It's great to hear from you. It's just like old times, isn't it? It's hard. It's very difficult to know. I suppose there's a tendency to think that there's an administrator like Eddington isn't, because he's worried about the pounds, shillings, and pence. But the way in which he intervenes, something about the kind of the details of when he intervenes and how he intervenes. So in the 1350s, his clerk goes to deliver money to the painters, or what must have been a kind of reward for some specific moment in the painting process. And the stalls that we looked at, you know, we don't know why they rejected them, but they're looking at the form of them and the mode of them, as the Latin says. So it suggests there's some sort of aesthetic assessment. It may be a practical assessment as well. So it does, to me, it does suggest some kind of engagement. I wouldn't have. I think at the higher, I would tend to put it at the higher level rather than at Walter of Weston's level, but I imagine Weston may be, I mean, one of the things that occurred to me about Weston, and I can't remember whether we talked about this, is that Weston came from Bordeaux. And of course, Joan, the young daughter of Edward III, died in Bordeaux. I did wonder whether there was some sort of resonance there. It's very hard, obviously it's very hard to pin it down, but straws maybe to play with. What do you think?
Well, James can respond perhaps.
Very interested to hear what James said.
Yeah, so we hope he will. This rejection of the stalls is very, very odd, it has to be said, given that they were commissioned in a sort of bespoke job. Was it this man, someone of St Andrews, who with the name St Andrews, who's supposed to have made these stalls? Or is that someone else I'm thinking of? Around 1350, there was a man with the Oppenham St Andrews, and he's always interested. A canon of somewhere in the Midlands, an Augustinian canon, as opposed to. It's in Colvin, anyway. Okay.
We better move on. Virginia Jansen has asked. She says, wonderful to be at a BAA lecture without travelling for hours from California. Bravo, BAA. Hope to attend virtually again.
It wasn't actually a question, but thanks, Virginia. That's great.
It's lovely to see you too. Sarah Gray asks, she thanks you very much for the lecture, and she asks, what was the import source of gold leaf? And was the trade interrupted by the plague? So where's the gold coming from?
Where's the gold coming from? I'm afraid I don't know. Need to ask a paintings specialist. I'm not sure. The king is playing with the quality of gold in the currency at this point.
Okay, and Richard Jones asks, it would be interesting to recover the prices of the various goods and a comprehensive list of all materials. Yeah, so that's a comment. Meg joins me and you as well, Tim, in asking James if he would respond. So that would be great. I wanted to say on that there is a sense in which patrons do exercise a certain amount of agency in creative terms, but it's a sort of remote. I mean, the king's the patron by remote control, as it were. But you know, insofar as Eddington is invested with the power to make day-to-day decisions on site, and this is a man with considerable experience of managing a patronage of his own, and also of managing these sorts of affairs. Insofar as he makes these decisions about how much gets spent on what or where, I suppose he does have a sort of negative role in the creative process. He's not designing anything, but he's saying what can and can't happen to an extent, I guess. That's not up to the workman.
Hello, everyone. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, I am. Hello, Tim. Hello, everyone else. So this issue of Eddington, Elizabeth and I have discussed him actually quite heavily. So a lot of this is her work as much as mine, but I think he's an unusual case. And between us, we get the impression that he's kind of, Edward III sort of got sick of the chapel in the 1340s. He's reached the point where, God, this has been going on for what, 130 years now? It's not quite that long at that point, but it's been quite a long time. So I reckon I've got to get this done. So, but I'm kind of busy. I've got this sort of war in France, all these things going on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my boy Eddington on it. He's the treasurer. He knows where he's got the fingers in all the pies, and he can just sort it out. He's in charge of the college. He can sort that college out, get that St Stephen's thing all sorted, get the statutes sorted out, and he kind of sort of hands it off to him. So I think it's not very surprising that he ends up doing lots of stuff with the, he ends up organising lots of the college stuff. I think the statutes, I think Elizabeth found out they were all sort of signed in his house or something like that. So he's an unusual case. You don't get that kind of involvement with the earlier administrators who seem to be involved in it, they seem to have a much more low-key involvement, and I think Tim's very much sort of put his very much put his sort of finger on the pulse there. A lot of the early ones, they seem to be just sort of you know, they're bean counters. They're making sure all the sort of everything is accounted for, because that's their job. But he is unusual. So I just get the impression that Edward III's reached the point where he just needs somebody to just be there at Westminster or in the area, just sorting everything out for him, and he does it. And it doesn't mean, and I don't think that Edward III's not involved in the chapel at that point, but I think he needs someone he trusts on the ground to sort of work it all out. And the stalls are weird. It's very weird, because they put an awful amount of time and money into making them, and then they don't like them. And why would the stalls be not good enough for the canons of Westminster, but good enough for the nuns at Barking? It's interesting. I wish they survived, because someone could do an excellent gendered study of that particular mess. But it's fascinating. So that's all I've really got to say on that.
Okay, and just before Tim answers, I'll say to everybody listening that that was James Hilson responding. You mightn't have been aware of that. Tim?
Well, yes, and to explain that James has written a wonderful PhD precisely about St Stephen's Chapel and the patronage of it. Yes, I mean, I'd have one just to follow up on the stalls. I agree, they're really curious. I did wonder whether the problem we had when we were trying to create virtual stalls might suggest for our virtual model in our visualization for the St Stephen's project might say something about it, because there was a big question about the back of the stalls and whether they would conceal the paintings under the windows or not.
Yes.
So I don't know, but just kind of hunch that maybe they took the wrong measurements and forgot the paintings were there, and somebody then said,
that is one of my suspicions. Certainly they do seem to have cut into the actual stonework in order to install them, which is a fascinating act of vandalism, and just shows how medieval designers, they don't care about that sort of thing. They'll happily chop away everything that they can throw it out. You know, it sounds crazy to us who are so interested in preservation, but then again, if you look at what often happens in parish churches, they have a very similar attitude. They'll just drag it all out. So there's actually quite a lot of substructure as well that's involved in them, and I suspect it's the canopies that are the particular issue, and it may be to do with visibility of those things, but it may also be to do with other concerns. I mean, for example, it could be that there's some concern with the number of people they have to fit in there, because another problem I recall when we were doing the digital model, which all of you should go and look at, by the way, it's really good. It's all online. But it is that the number of people you had to put in there is actually quite a lot. So in terms of cramming them into those stalls, there's quite some difficulty of how you physically fit all those people in that space. So I don't know, that's another thing I've never considered before that might be worth looking into. Not sure, but for whatever reason, they really don't like it, but they're clearly usable as stalls. So it's not like they've got some sort of, I don't know, sort of bodged building job that's got it.
No, there's some simple explanation we just can't see. Thank you very much, James. I want to keep going because we've got a few more questions. Unless Tim, you want to respond to what James said in any way, we've got a few more questions.
Fascinating, but good to pursue.
Sure. So thank you, James. Thank you very much. Margaret Cormack says, agree with Virginia on how great it is for us all to get together like this. Many of us just don't have the option to come all the way to London. Yeah, I know the feeling. Pecunious graduate students, retirees, even when there isn't a COVID emergency, it would be nice if lectures could be made available during or afterwards. Thanks very much. So that's good. That's good feedback for us, and also very nice of you. Thank you, Margaret. Stephen Brindle says, congratulations on this magnificent achievement, Tim. Do you know who succeeded William Ramsay as craftsman in charge? At Windsor, it was John Sponley as mason and William Herland as carpenter.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Your research at Windsor was invaluable, and we benefited hugely from the transcriptions that you've made of the accounts there. Yes, Ramsay's successor at St Stephen's is John Box from 1350, and it's William Hurley who's responsible, it says explicitly in the accounts, for the stalls at the beginning. William Hurland is his deputy, and then takes over after Hurley dies.
Okay, thank you. Michael asks, would you be able to comment on ideas about centre and periphery in relation to individual artists and their movements between jobs or from one patron to another?
Yeah. Well, Michael, thanks for that. Obviously, this has been an issue in previous discussion of St Stephen's as a potential dissemination point for architectural ideas, for example, across the country. I mean, I think great building centres of building work are opportunities for people to experience new ideas and new techniques and so on. And this clearly was one example. Whether this is, I think, putting it in, I would want to put it in relation to other great foyers and centres of, like cathedrals, for example, or other building projects that bring very large numbers of people together to share their experience. If that answers your question.
Thank you. Perhaps in response to Margaret Cormack, Richard Plant reminds us that the lectures are for the most part available to the on the association's website and on YouTube. So that's worth remembering. I've read out, that's the end of the, oh no, Lloyd De Beer has now logged a question, which is interesting. Thanks, Tim. Absolutely fascinating. To see other members of Edward's family are so prominently displayed, is there a sense of their contribution to the project? The Black Prince or Philip of Hainaut, for example. Have any sense?
That's a fascinating question. Not that I know of, but there may well be other kinds of sources that I mean, I don't know of any evidence. I'll have a think and let you know if I can think of anything comes to mind, but I can't immediately. Thanks, Dave. It's a good question.
Yes, of course. Veronica Secules wrote that article on Philippa of Hainaut as a patron, so I don't know if she says anything. Okay, we don't have any more questions here. I quickly want to come out with a mea culpa. I've read out a couple of things that have privately said, but I don't think I've perjured anyone or myself for that matter. They were posted with the privately note, but because I'm such a techno moron, I just sort of make these mistakes. So I'm sorry about that. It doesn't matter. I mean, they were good questions, and I'm sure they keep on coming if we kept the lecture open long enough. But Tim, we have to let you go. We can't keep you forever. We're delighted with this contribution. We're delighted the thing has worked so well. It's been a great experience for the BAA, as well as just hearing stuff about this project, which we've all been so excited about and have known it's going on for so long, and now it's come to fruition in this marvellous volume and in the website and all the work other people have done, and you've mentioned the people on the project. So thank you very much indeed. I'm glad we haven't dragged you down to London and infected you with anything, and it's just been marvellous. So thank you so much, Tim.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, and thank everybody who attended. It's a terrific event. Thank you.